Pensacola, Florida, New Year's Day 1985, the body of a young woman found lying on the side of a busy street, partially naked. She has been sex assaulted.
He strangled her and then dumped her on the side of the road like a piece of trash.
Investigators struggle to find the killer.
As the time passes, then the chances of solving that case becomes percentage-wise less and less. And after 3 days, then it seems like the percentage goes down very dramatically, and then it becomes a cold case.
Decades later, the case is reopened, and a brand new team of detectives takes over.
There's always something that's left behind. Anytime that there's a homicide, it's just a matter of finding it.
This is the story of how a cold-blooded killer faces a powerful opponent, an opponent that does not exist when he commits his crime. I'm Nancy Grace, and this is Bloodline Detectives. Pensacola, Florida, 1985, a small, picturesque coastal city situated on the Gulf of Mexico.
Back in the 80s, it was a place that was like everywhere else in America, struggling, economically to find its place and looking for what was going to be the next thing to kind of bring it into the 21st century.
Peace in this normally sleepy part of town is shattered. New Year's Day, 1985.
A lady that lived on Peacock Drive, she and two friends at 2 o'clock in the morning were taking their dog to an overnight vet. When she was returning home at 5:15 in the morning, that was when they noticed a body alongside the road. That was pre-cell phone days, so they had to go back to the house to make the phone call.
Police respond to the 911 call and rush to the scene.
I arrived at the crime scene somewhere around 6 a.m. and contacted our crime scene supervisor, Bob Grant, who was on scene already.
There were some homes there. This was like a small subdivision, but there were some lots, like a wooded lot, that had not had a home built on it at the time. And we observed a body of a white female lying on the side of the road. We saw a towel by her body. She was in what I would call like evening clothes, or party clothes, so to speak. Her clothes were in disarray and pulled up, and there was some blood. It appeared to be blood around her head. Not a great deal, but there were some scrape marks and abrasions and that type of thing.
There was a 5-centimeter wide laceration on her forehead. There was some blood in her hair, but not a lot of blood on her body. And it's clear that there had been a very violent struggle.
We assumed right off the bat that it was a sexual battery, and that was based on the condition of her clothing and the fact that the crime occurred somewhere else. Being so close to the road, that wouldn't have been where the assault took place. It was at a corner lot, at the corner of 2 streets. And if she had been assaulted there, it would have been away from the highway. The only evidence that was obvious to me, besides the victim, was the clothing that she had on and the blue towel that we found next to her head.
There's a principle in crime scene investigation called Locard's principle. And Locard's principle is that there is always something left at a scene and taken from a scene that will lead you back to your suspect.
One early clue is the discovery of the victim's shoes, 2 miles from where her body is found.
They were both on Spanish Trail, and they were separated by about 400 feet. So we surmised from that that whoever dumped the body had traveled that way, either coming or going to the crime scene, and was throwing items out of the car.
The priority for investigators is to identify the victim.
Bob Grant, the crime scene supervisor, took fingerprints from the body, and it was the sheriff's department that identified the prints as belonging to a Tonya McKinley.
Tonya Etheridge McKinley was born on January 25th, 1961 in Milton, Florida. She was a lot of fun, loved to go to parties, loved to make friends, got married at a pretty young age and divorced at a pretty young age. And then eventually she moved to Pensacola and met a guy named Tim Davidson, and they had a son, Tim Davidson Jr. A lot of the things she was doing in her life around the time she got murdered was to make a better life for herself and her son. She dropped out of high school, but she was going back to get a technical degree from a place in Pensacola.
Investigators now focus on Tonya McKinley's recent partner named Tim Davidson. He's the father of her toddler boy, a child now left without a mother.
He was very cooperative. He gave us enough information for us to know where she was the night before and who she was with. He told us what his activities were the night before and names of people that could verify that. We did ask him if he would take a polygraph, which he agreed to, and that was scheduled for about 2 days later.
A young mother trying desperately to build a better life for herself and her little boy. That life cut short. But can her partner shed light on her murder? A murder that takes place that fateful New Year's Eve, 1985. I'm Nancy Grace, and that's next on Bloodline Detectives. Pensacola, Florida, New Year's Day, 1985. The semi-nude body of a beautiful young woman, Tonya McKinley, found dumped on the side of a city street. Within 24 hours, police questioned her former partner, Tim Davidson.
The victim's last known movements are extremely important. We didn't have the luxury of having that until the following morning when Tim Davidson came down to speak to us. He was the first one that told us that what her activities had been the previous night. And he had gotten that information from her cousin.
Tonya Etheridge McKinley was hanging out with her cousin, Vanita, and her husband, Larry. And they were going out for the night, and they just got childcare until, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning.
It becomes very clear that Tim Davidson played no part in Tonya's death. It's also clear that Tonya McKinley spends New Year's Eve at a highly popular local restaurant, Daryl's Bar and Grill.
Daryl's was a bar and grill that was located in the north end of town.
And her cousin left to go pick up Tonya's son from the babysitter. And that left Tonya there at the bar. Her cousin Vanita assumed that she would get a ride home with friends.
After about 1:30, nobody knows anything about Tonya. They don't know when she left. They don't know if she left alone. We had very little information to go on at all.
Pensacola police visit Daryl's Bar and Grill. The bartender, Kurt Lisk, actually knows Tonya McKinley personally. He also becomes a person of interest.
They dated a couple times, so they knew each other, and he had spent a little bit of time with her talking. So we asked him to come down to the police station to give us a further in-depth interview, which he did. And during that interview, he remained nervous. The investigators asked him if he would be willing to take a polygraph. He agreed to it. He was given a polygraph right away. The polygraph examiner reviewed the results, and it was his determination at the time that Kurt passed the polygraph, that his version of what he did that night was accurate.
Police rule out 2 men who dated Tonya McKinley as suspects. Detectives now hope her autopsy will provide solid leads.
Initial pathology report showed that she had that laceration to the back of her head and that she had been strangled. And it also showed that there was a faint line that was 2 centimeters in width that went across the front of her neck.
There was a brown hair that was determined to come from a Caucasian, and there was also a brown pubic hair that was determined to come from a Caucasian. And investigators knew that these were not Tonya's hairs and assumably came from the perpetrator of this crime.
Investigators now beg for help outside Pensacola. They approach the FBI's emerging behavioral science unit in Quantico, Virginia.
According to the information they had, they felt like Tonya was a risk taker. She would be somebody that would hitchhike, accept a ride from a stranger. They felt that the crime itself was a one-on-one, a stranger-on-stranger crime.
They called it an opportunity killer, someone who saw an opening and took it, someone that had it, in them to do something like that, but took advantage of the opportunity of, hey, here's a vulnerable person.
The psychological profile on the suspect was based on the fact that there was no indication that any type of a weapon was used. It was more, the injuries she sustained were more from a struggle. They did say that they felt like it could have been the fact that he made sexual advances towards her which she refused. And when he pursued it, based on the fact that she was a fighter, that physical confrontation resulted. And then from that, she was strangled.
The brutal rape and murder of Tonya McKinley is all over local news. Fear spreads throughout Pensacola.
It was front page news for that week, and it was one of the things, it bothered a lot of people that reported to the crime scene. The law enforcement that showed up, I've talked to them, it's something you don't shake.
And people would like to think that you're safe in your community if you're going to go out and be a reveler on New Year's Eve. They like to think that they're safe. So I imagine for some people it was a reality check that are they doing things in their own life that could lead to something tragic happening.
Investigators used all the tools available in 1985, but Tonya McKinley's murder goes cold.
The investigation itself was a year-long investigation. We had no witnesses that saw her leave, so we didn't know if she left alone, if she left with somebody. Any persons of interest that we had in those first couple of days, they all passed polygraphs. Their alibis all panned out.
There's not a moment when a case officially becomes cold necessarily. It just happens because over time, new leads stop coming in. There's no new evidence. There's no one else to talk to. And they hit a wall. In this case, that pretty much happened. And they just weren't finding what they needed to bring forth the criminal prosecution. They did not have the evidence to do so.
Tonya McKinley's murder investigation goes cold, but detectives have one valuable piece of evidence: semen left behind at the crime scene. Can they find a way to link it to her killer? That's next on Bloodline Detectives. New Year's Day, 1985, Pensacola, Florida. The semi-nude body of 23-year-old Tonya McKinley found dumped on a city street. After a full year of dead ends, the case goes cold. But 15 years later, a brand new team of investigators takes over.
There was semen on the vaginal swab, and there was semen on the blue towel, in addition to having the blood of Tonya McKinley on that towel. So having that amount of biological material was a plus for solving this case.
You always think about the cases that you've never cleared, and we had put so much time and effort into this one. We had interviewed in excess of 70 people. We had conducted 3 search warrants. We had conducted 6 polygraphs, submitted samples for DNA testing. So, we had a lot invested in the case. You don't forget that.
When I first became a detective, there were senior detectives and senior officers in the department who had worked on the initial case. And so there was always an interest in whether or not somebody could pick up the case and do something with it. And periodically we would. It was an unsolved case, which meant it was a priority if someone could figure out something to do with it that hadn't already been done, or to see if a new technology had arisen that would allow us to do something with the case. And in my career, 2 things have occurred. It was the advent of DNA being more prevalent in casework, and so there was a need to resubmit it for DNA evidence, and that came back with no matches. And so it kind of languished there until something new happened, and that's what led to this particular case being reopened in 2018.
In 2018, a very powerful new forensic science becomes available to investigators. It's called genetic genealogy. It links a DNA code found in evidence like semen to a wider group of people than just the perpetrator. Genetic genealogy may show a match to the killer's family member.
I was approached by a detective who was working a missing persons case, and he had heard about genetic genealogy and wanted to try it with his case. So I set up a meeting with Parabon and had that detective plus several other detectives in the investigation unit, and we received a presentation by Parabon, and we soon found out that unfortunately that missing person case did not qualify for genetic genealogy. But then I thought immediately that the Tonya McKinley case did qualify. So I approached the captain at the time, Kristen Brown, and took it to her, and she took it to the chief at the time, and he approved going forward with pursuing genetic genealogy. And so we got that ball rolling.
Detectives understand very well submitting the DNA sample to the genetic genealogy specialists at Parabon Nanolabs comes with its own set of complications.
We had to send our DNA sample to a lab in Oklahoma to be reworked. The way a DNA sample goes into the CODIS system is different than the way a DNA sample goes into these genetic genealogy websites. So the DNA had to be reworked. So that was the first step. And we took that step in January of 2019.
From the crime scene, they were able to find foreign DNA. And that DNA was from a male that they believed was responsible for her murder. So that's the DNA that was submitted to Parabon for us to develop a SNP profile and then perform investigative genetic genealogy on.
What's so incredible about this technology, and this is where it really gets into science fiction, investigators and researchers are able to cross-reference DNA with public accessible databases of DNA. So these are the type of things that you and I do when we try to find out what country our relatives are from. All that is put in a big pool. And so they can look at that information and try to find out victims and perpetrators of crimes. And in this case, that's exactly what they did.
From the DNA, we knew that he was male. And so I was looking for a male of the right age. Didn't know if he was young or old, but of an age where he wasn't too young or too old, to be able to perpetrate this crime, and I knew it was somebody that had to be in the area where she was found around the time that she was discovered. Working with the DNA of the unknown suspect, as I do on all my cases, I create genetic networks. I compare those top matches to some of the more distant matches and try to find clusters of matches that are sharing DNA with each other. Then I build their trees and I try to identify their common ancestors. If I'm successful in doing that, then I can piece his family tree back together, piece by piece by piece. It's like a puzzle. I have to find that one person or that set of siblings that is related to all of those top or key matches. And so in this case, even though I didn't have a lot of strong matches, I was able to develop 4 separate genetic networks. So those 4 genetic networks represent one branch of his family tree. When you have 4 separate genetic networks, that usually ensures that you're going to have some DNA matches connecting to the mother's side of the tree and some to the father's side. And so if we have matches that share X DNA in addition to the autosomal DNA, we know those matches are going to connect to that male's mother's side. And so in this case, I had a couple of matches that had significant amounts of shared X DNA. Those matches connected with some of my other matches, and so I knew that those genetic networks that included the matches with X DNA had to represent our unknown killer's mother's side of the tree. So in this case, I was able to find that union between 2 of the genetic networks. So that is very exciting. When those pieces start falling in place, it's a very exciting moment in my job because I know I'm heading in the right direction.
The key to forensic genetic genealogy is building an entire family tree from a single DNA source. Scientists who do this rarely come up with an immediate suspect. Instead, their work creates a big family tree made up of many, many generations. Investigators painstakingly narrow that family tree down until it points directly to the person linked to the DNA sample.
Chuck Mallett had big whiteboards put in, and he became somebody like that essentially worked like the people for Parabon. And these whiteboards became filled with hundreds and hundreds of names, and there were names on the board dating back to, the late 1700s in Pensacola, trying to put together family trees.
And so we got a lot of investigative leads. We got targets, people that we needed to either get their DNA or have them upload their profile into GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. Captain Mallett would identify those targets, and then he would contact them and try to get them either to do an ancestry DNA kit, or if they had a kit, to upload their profile into these databases. So it was a very arduous process to get these targets, and we would have a meeting and we'd identify the targets, and then we would get the results, and then we would kind of narrow it down, and we just kept narrowing it down, and FDLE did an amazing job with that. They did a lot of the genetic genealogy research. And then finally, they narrowed it down to Daniel Wells.
Daniel Wells is now the prime suspect in Tonya McKinley's murder. Detectives now must link him to the crime scene.
Captain Mallett began pulling the assets and the team together, our intel people, our crime scene folks, and then myself, with the specific purpose and intent of that we would have to obtain a DNA sample from them, and then eventually would lead to a conversation or an interrogation. So my use was in helping to recover evidence from a target, and then the eventual interrogation of that subject. And when we learned the name, we learned where he lived, where he worked, and then did a historical check for his history. And we found that he had some sexual deviant related charges and history in the past. Prostitution, exposure of sexual organs. So those sort of crimes seem to sort of fit with the type of person who would do a sexually motivated homicide. So that was a flag that, hey, this could actually be a potential suspect in this case, beyond simply having genetic markers or family members that were associated with the unknown suspect DNA. So he became of interest at that point.
Cold case investigators finally name a prime suspect, Daniel Wells. Next on Bloodline Detectives, they've got to track him down. February 2020, Pensacola, Florida, 35 years after the brutal rape and savage murder of 23-year-old Tonya McKinley. Thanks to genetic genealogy, investigators finally have the name of a suspect, Daniel Wells, but now police have to find him.
Genetic genealogy is most definitely a game changer for law enforcement. It has opened up not just to offenders who are subject to putting their DNA into CODIS, but it is all their family members who may not even realize that they are related to people who are out there committing murders or rapes.
One priority for detectives is to establish Daniel Wells' whereabouts on New Year's Day, 1985, the day Tonya McKinley is murdered.
The homicide was in 1985, and I needed to go back as far as I could to try to figure out where he's been since then. I wanted to see, was he even in the area at that time? I came across a traffic ticket from South Florida that had an address in Pensacola from March 30th of 1985.
He was the son of a pharmacist there in town, so came from a family that had a little bit of money. You know, he was the only son. He had a lot of sisters. He seemed like he had a pretty, I mean, other than his parents splitting up, it seemed like he had a pretty normal background.
Going back to the traffic citation in 1985, it listed on there that he was a carpenter. I saw that he had moved to Missouri, and when I was doing research, I saw that in Missouri he was also doing some type of woodwork. He got married in 1993, and then he was remarried again in 2003, and then he was back here in Pensacola around 2009. He had a son in that time frame. It appeared that he laid kind of low. I remember doing some research on social media at his place of employment and realized he was in none of their photos. They had Christmas parties, different gatherings. They would show people doing woodwork, and he was in none of the photos. And it just seemed like he kept to himself.
Daniel Wells' criminal past, including sex crimes, is critical information for investigators. They still need to link him directly to Tonya McKinley's murder. Detectives decide to conduct surveillance on Wells.
I was advised of the circumstances of the genealogy and the work that Sergeant Harnett and Captain Mallet had done on this case, and they needed assistance with surveillance of a possible suspect.
We went over who Daniel Wells was, where he worked, where he lived, and then, we kind of worked together and made up a sheet of different dates and times that surveillance was needed. I don't remember how many days, but it was several days. And just watching his movements, kind of, did he leave for work at the same time? Did he return home? Did he go to lunch regularly? Just try to put together a pattern.
We went to several places, several locations where Mr. Wells went to as well. A lot of places that he went, we were also present. I was able to get fairly close. I spoke to him actually during a lunch break. We were in the same restaurant. Just a random conversation about the food at the restaurant and just about our day, just very brief.
Over the course of a couple of days, we noticed that he was a smoker. So the idea was that we would have to try and obtain a sample of his DNA through surreptitious means. Because he was a smoker, the hope was that he would discard a cigarette. So we began following him with the intention of seeing if he would.
So the police follow him, and this is where it becomes basically a scene right out of a film. The police trail him in his car.
Myself and 2 special agents with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement were following Mr. Wells when one of the special agents noticed that he was smoking, saw him throw the discarded cigarette butt out the window, and so because we were in a few vehicles behind him, we immediately stopped, blocked traffic. Myself and that special agent went out, found the cigarette butt, recovered it, turned it in, and then brought it straight to the crime lab. The following day, they were able to tell us that there was a match, and it matched Daniel Wells.
It was very exciting. There were a lot of high fives and cheers, and it was a very exciting moment. The day we found out was kind of a very somber day for the police department. We had just lost a officer, and so that was kind of a high note that we ended that day on. That yes, finally after 35 years, we know who killed Tonya McKinley.
After 35 long years and thousands of man-hours, investigators finally have the DNA match linking Daniel Wells directly to Tonya McKinley's murder. Now, detectives move in for an arrest. That's next on Bloodline Detectives. Pensacola, Florida, March 2020. 35 years after 23-year-old Tonya McKinley was raped and murdered, detectives are finally ready to confront and arrest the prime suspect, now 57-year-old Daniel Wells.
We didn't know what his mindset was or if he was expecting this to eventually happen, but we knew that he was a bad driver, and so we knew that we could pull him over at some point because of the fact that he had a propensity for speeding. So we decided that that would probably be the safest route to conduct a traffic stop.
In this particular case, what they decided to do was a traffic stop, which is where myself and Detective Osley came into play.
Detective Earhart and I got into a marked vehicle, and when Mr. Wells got mobile in his vehicle, we conducted a traffic stop on him.
It was March 17th, and the very next day is when Pensacola kind of shut down for COVID. So a lot was going on and people were very concerned. So I asked him, due to kind of everything that was going on, would he mind stepping outside of the car to speak with me so that we could kind of have that open air environment? And he complied with no question.
We're good? This has some stuff we gotta talk to you about. We're gonna sort it out pretty quick.
I'll give you your wallet back when we get there. You mind just walking back over here for me?
He was taken into custody, brought to the police station by those 2 detectives, and then eventually we sat down in a room with him here at the police department and had that conversation.
All right, let's cut the chase. So that young lady I just showed you a picture of. Right. New Year's Eve 1984 going 1985. January 1st, early morning 1985. Okay. Was found dead on the side of a road. And I have the evidence that you're the one that's there. Oh. I have irrefutable evidence that you're there. I'm not doing all this on a guess. I'm not doing all this.
No, I don't. No.
On a hunch. Dan.
Yeah.
Telling you you're there.
I wasn't there.
After an hour of denying he was present at Tonya McKinley's murder, Daniel Wells runs out of lies.
It was an awesome moment when, he's confronted with, you can say you weren't there, but we have undeniable evidence that you were there. He finally admitted that, first it was just small admissions that, I just had consensual sex with her. But, he was being presented with, we know you just didn't have consensual sex.
And so we offered 2 different scenarios. The 2 scenarios were either you're a monster who's going out hunting women, and we utilize his criminal history that kind of purport that. And we're able to kind of link that to a behavior sort of like Ted Bundy, someone who would lure women to him to prey upon them. And that paints a picture of him being a complete monster. So he's not gonna like that. And the other option was that you had an encounter with her, things got out of hand, and eventually led to you having to kill her, or something took place to where that was what you did. And so with those two choices, he chose the lesser evil of the two choices in that. And then he shared with us what actually happened.
And we went by my house, and we had a few drinks and stuff, and it just escalated from that. She I think I hit her in the head and knocked her out. And it was a traumatic blow. And it killed her.
Take her out, you put her in a truck, you drive around, and just drive and dump her on the side of the road.
Yeah,
Nothing.
like a bag of trash, man.
Captain Chuck Mallett can now tell Tonya's son, Tim Davidson Jr., his mother's case is finally solved.
I heard that phone call on a recording, and it was extremely emotional. It was, here Tim, who didn't even learn that his mother had been murdered until he was 14 years old. And to know that, we finally caught his killer was very emotional for both Captain Mallett and for Tim Davidson.
Daniel Wells taken into custody pending trial. Then, on April 20, 2020, justice takes an unexpected turn.
I was at home around 6 a.m. and I got a call from Chuck Mallett. He told me that Daniel Wells had committed suicide in his cell at Escambia County Jail.
When you try to get in the mind of somebody that commits suicide, that is entirely different. You never know what real reason that they committed a guilty conscience. They didn't want their family to suffer what he was going to have to go through.
I was disappointed. I was very much looking forward to facing him at a trial. So I was disappointed that he had taken this coward's way out, that he could not even survive 2 weeks in jail after he deprived this woman of her life 35 years ago and had been living free for 35 years.
I can see where any family might feel cheated by that. They didn't get a chance to confront him, and so sometimes that's something that's highly desirable to the family. And I know that they felt cheated for not having that opportunity.
It takes 35 years for detectives to finally nail Tonya McKinley's killer. It would never have been possible without the precise work of crime scene investigators back in 1985. They secured and preserved evidence, which years later proved essential.
It gives you a feeling of pride to know that not only you, but the other people that you work with do the best they can and do whatever is needed to try and solve a case.
I was just really happy to be able to help and play a part in this. There were a lot of different components in this as far as the work from the original detectives all the way through to Parabon and FDLE and Captain Mallett, our crime scene people. So even just having a small corner of the investigation, it was rewarding. There was a sense of accomplishment. It was nice to be able to give closure to a case that's been lingering. There was a lot of interest in this case from the older detectives when I first became one in solving it. And there was always the hope that eventually someone would be able to do so. So it was nice to be able to give them that and to play a part in that.
The role of forensic genetic genealogy is the other essential ingredient in cracking Tonya McKinley's brutal rape and savage murder.
I don't believe it would have been solved without genetic genealogy. Wells, unless he had committed a crime to have his DNA put into CODIS, he would have remained undetectable. So this case has been solved because of genetic genealogy.
Tonya McKinley's son, Tim, was just 18 months old when his mother was savagely murdered. Some say he never really knew his mother, but that bond between mother and child is so deep and so eternal, it will always exist. I'm Nancy Grace. Thank you for being with us here at Bloodline Detectives.